So let's do some hindsight kind of things. If you were an organizational leader, a board chair or a president, what are 2 or 3 things that you wished you had known 3 years ago that you know now about organizational development, board leadership, organizational leadership? Are there things that you've said, here's some things I would say to a president, here's some things I would say to a board chair?
I think the thing that's important for any president of any institution that is in distress is to develop a very personal relationship to his or her chair. I think that is essential to the well-functioning environment of a board. And I think that I was very fortunate to have lucked into that with Chair Terhune. And I think that that was critical to the success of our closure. So I think my counsel to any president who finds themselves in a distressed condition as an institution is to be absolutely certain that you respect and trust your chair. And that if there is any concern between you, that those things get aired, because there is simply, when you call the question as an organization, there is no room for daylight between your chair and your president. And I was fortunate to have had that. And I think the only other thing I would offer around this question is that I would say too that I was fortunate that my chair had unusual skill in communicating, and we haven't talked about external communications after the announcement, but to your point earlier about board communications, the ability to set the tone in the boardroom, to invite every single person to share his or her concern, was a culture that was really enhanced when Chip ascended to the chair of the board. And I think that too is an absolutely critical component. And I was just unbelievably fortunate to have had that at the moment. And I know, because I train boards for a living now, that that is not true everywhere.
Great point. So what do you wish you had known? And what advice or wisdom would you have for board members and a board chair as you kind of think about that?
You know, I have actually spent a fair amount of time contemplating that over the course of the time since we closed. You know, I think the biggest element of success in an environment where there's crisis as it relates to a board of trustees or a nonprofit board in managing through that crisis is the work that was done prior to the crisis itself. And that work is, for me, focused around culture. And if you can create a culture of trust and credibility and an embracing and welcoming of diversity of opinion, and you can create that safe space in a boardroom where people feel duty-bound to share their thoughts and listen carefully and thoughtfully to others, you can actually manage through a crisis with grace. I think if you arrive at a crisis without that culture really being a part of the institution and the governance, it's really hard to create it in a hurry and arguably impossible. So from my vantage point, I think that is, you know, the search for truth, the search for reality, the transparency that's necessary, and the creation of a safe space are the essential ingredients for governance success in a crisis like we had.
Yeah, that's a great one. So give us a couple other tips on how you create that kind of a culture in a board that is honesty and full disclosure and all that. What are 2 or 3 things that you learned that were important that would cultivate that?
Well, I will pay a compliment back to my partner, President Rose. Having a president who was just by nature transparent and honest and earnest in telling the truth and the latest findings, however they might be, really put the board in a position that it needed to listen. It needed to heed the words of the president and the other cabinet members as truth was being told. And I think from my vantage point, it was a simpler thing for, as chair, to make sure that the board of trustees themselves individually felt heard throughout those conversations. I would also maybe highlight that I really wish we had spent time years in advance really focused on forecast modeling, whether it's around enrollment or whether it's around operational budgeting. I think the reality is we, like so many, were surprised, I think, by where we found ourselves on a relative basis. But the good news is that we, I think, were a lot less surprised than many other boards might be because of the good work that President Rose and her team did in really focusing on understanding where we stood financially.
Yeah, that's great. Would you all talk just a little bit about, because the relationship of the board with the executive leadership, you all, in a sense, have been in conversation, have access to information, and it's enough to have to get all of those folks on the same page. How did you all work at communicating with other constituencies, and what did you find particularly challenging about that, and what did you find that really helped in that, in communication?
Yeah, well, of course, the main constituency outside the board is going to be your campus. And working there and walking the campus every single day was a very poignant reminder of the responsibilities that we all carry, right? I would talk to students every day, talk to staff and faculty every day. And I had, again, this is in support of the chair's argument that you must have created a culture years prior to be able to pull off of closure with grace. So when I started at the institution, in hindsight, I'm so grateful that I had the natural tendency, I think, to call together the entire institution on a regular basis. So beginning with my very first term, fall of 2014, I held institution-wide meetings quarterly. And when you're as tiny as you are at a Marylhurst University, you can actually have your entire staff and faculty in a room. And I basically gave state of the university talks every single term that I was there. And around that same time, I would also hold an open session with students. And of course, we are sharing developments, we're sharing announcements. The closer we got to the board's decision on closure, the more challenging those conversations began. The campus was involved in the budget process, had been deeply involved in the budget process that year, so they knew we were working against an operational deficit, and they knew that we did not have an identified means of solving that operational deficit. So these conversations grew increasingly challenging, and I will say that this is the rub for any president facing the possibility of closure. You have, on the one hand, a responsibility to your board to provide them with the time for thoughtful consideration, debate, discernment before they reach their conclusion. And that requires a degree of confidentiality to protect that environment for your fiduciaries. On the other hand, there is a campus responsibility to bring folks along, to give them enough information that you are being truthful about the challenges that you face, but you don't want to incite panic on a campus when the board has not made a decision. And so I would say the most difficult thing about that spring from my vantage point was balancing those two responsibilities well. And I think there are different ways to do that, but I will share that I think that was single-handedly the most challenging part of the circumstances. And my leadership team on campus grappled with this day in and day out. I had my VP of development out talking to our major donors, being clear with them about our challenges, but again, not willing to go so far as to predict what our board would do. That decision can only be made by a board, and we wanted to give them their rightful place to make it.
How about from your perspective, what are the things that you would say were important ones?
So for me, once a hard decision like closure happens, there are sort of two binary tracks that I think governance can take. One is to retreat, having made the decision, and allow the process to move forward, but providing direction and decisions, but not engaging directly. And the other one is to show compassion and humanity and to lean in. And I would say, I think I'll be forever indebted to President Rose and her team for allowing me the opportunity, and others on the board, the opportunity to sit with students and sit with faculty and sit with staff and have a conversation as they grapple with the reality of what closure meant. And those conversations were uncomfortable, they were difficult, they were emotional, and they were incredibly important. And I think that as those conversations occurred, it kept in mind for myself and the rest of the governance board the values that we had been living by continue to live on even during closure. And that the legacy that we were building for Marylhurst, even after it closed, was one that was an absolute testament to the legacy that it had for 125 years while it was thriving. And I think from my vantage point, the only way you arrive at that kind of legacy and that kind of closure is by making decisions in a timely fashion, by being transparent and creating that safe place for all voices, and for leaning in with compassion after the decision has been made to make sure that the folks that are traveling that journey, first and foremost, have someone to chat with and talk with and be themselves with, no matter how they're grappling with the circumstance.